Hey there, welcome to Unit 5, Lesson 2. Today we're going to continue learning more about the 50s, really focusing more on the 50s, but what I'm going to be discussing today really did translate into the 60s as well. And our focus today is looking at the economy, because the economy is going to go through some ups and downs, but we're going to focus today on whether or not we actually think that the economy was this like great good old days economy that everybody talks about with the 1950s. So I have a very short set of notes to go through with you, and then you're going to learn about your assignment, and then you need to complete that. So let's go ahead and get into these notes real quick. So once the war was over and World War II comes to an end, we end up having a big post-war boom. A lot of people were surprised about this because remember, we came out of the Depression. The war was what pulled us out of the Depression, was making all of those items in the factories for the war. But then once we didn't have to make those anymore, was the economy going to take a big dive again? But surprisingly, we experienced a really good boom. Um, Basically what happened is that we were able to, let me move this out of the way, I'm distracting myself. Basically what happened was that we were able to move from a wartime production to a peacetime production pretty easily. It was a little difficult, but we pulled through it successfully, and then the economy would just continue to grow during this time. Now there were over 1 million workers who were laid off at the end of the war, but you have to remember a lot of those that were laid off were women, and those women for the most part just went back into the homes to be housewives instead of being at work. And then when the soldiers came back, they took those jobs back. So it wasn't as big of a detriment as it sounds. There were some issues with price controls during the war. There had been some government price controls put into place. Those were lifted once the war was over, which caused prices to kind of like jack up a lot. And so we saw some inflation. But again, it was like a little bit of a difficult transition, but we actually got through it pretty easily. So when the war is over, we want to do everything we can to be able to help out the soldiers who are coming back. They had fought so bravely and deserved to be helped upon their return. So we see Congress pass what is known as the GI Bill of Rights, or really what is just referred to often as the GI Bill. And its goal was to help these veterans return back to civilian life and be able to have a successful life and create the American dream for themselves after they went overseas and fought to keep that American dream alive. So in 1944, before the war is even over, Congress passes this bill. And it's going to do a few things to really help out the veterans. It's going to help to pay for higher education. So if they want to go to college, for example, it's going to give them huge breaks when it comes to that. It guarantees a year's worth of unemployment benefits for when they came back from the war. It wasn't necessarily going to be easy. Now, at this time, there wasn't anything labeled as like PTSD, but don't get that confused with the fact that these soldiers were still experiencing PTSD and coming back. And so transitioning, sorry, the air conditioning just came on its own. The transition of war life back into civilian life isn't always easy for everybody, and not everybody's ready to go get a job immediately and stuff. So this was going to help them to have some time basically to get up on their feet. And then it also encouraged business creation and the ability for people to go out and get homes through through the ability for them to go to banks and get very low interest loans so they can start businesses or have their home, start their family, get their life going. So here you can just see a couple posters that would be around. This one's going to be telling veterans to go to their local office and learn some information about how to go get secondary education. Here you see this former soldier contemplating if he needs to go back to school or not. Here's another one that's asking them, like, are you interested in buying a farm or a home or starting your own business? Come to us and you can get some guaranteed loans. So these are all things to be able to help them out. The last thing that I want to talk to you about is that when they did come back and they bought these homes and stuff, we're going to see huge amounts of suburban growth. So suburban, of course, being areas outside of the city. So we start to see a lot of these families set up shop in the outskirts of the city, like Concord to Charlotte, for example. And so the GI Bill and high employment levels meant that a lot of people could afford to buy their own home in these new neighborhoods, especially these neighborhoods that were popping up left and right. So a man by the name of William Levitt basically created this way to kind of assembly line build houses. So they were like not individual houses, but you're like your little cookie cutter. Every house kind of looks the same with a little tiny bit of variation. And they're all crammed together in one neighborhood, and they can like build them really, really fast and mass produce these houses. These were going to be referred to as Levitowns across the nation, named after William Levitt. So you can see here the shift in population that is happening. We've got people living in the cities is going to stay about the same, right? So about 32% of people living in the cities from the 1940s to the 1970s. But you can see here the suburbs are going to have an explosion. So we go from 20% all the way over to about 42% of people living in the suburbs. And those rural areas and small towns are going to take a big hit. So they go from about 50% of the population down to about a quarter of the population. So that's where we're going to see this big shift that is happening. I don't know what's going on with my air conditioning right now. If you can hear that, just ignore that. So this is a kind of like above ground picture of those neighborhoods that I was talking about, where they just crammed in all of these houses, like house by house by house. And here you can see an advertisement for Levittown in 1957. And so people that would want to build a house, they would kind of look at, here's what my options are, which one do I want to buy and which one do I want to have built? And then they were all kind of about the same, like I said, with small minor variations. So here's what you're going to do. The thing is that for the 1950s, you often hear people talk about like, we need to go back to the 50s and the good old days. Were the good old days actually really good? And were they good for everybody? That's what your focus for today's lesson is going to be. So we're going to click on this assignment right here. And it says the 1950s, a decade of prosperity or hardship. In order to do this, you've got some reading documents that are here. You're going to look at those articles. They're not very long. And then you're going to open up this assignment. And as you are reading the articles, you're going to go and fill in the Google Doc and then turn it in. The very first one talks about the name of the article is 10 Amazing Years from 1947 to 1957. And it says a decade of miracles. So you're going to tell me how each of the different following areas experienced change or growth in the 1950s. So population changes, changes in driving, changes in what was in the kitchen, media, recreation, cities, jobs, education. So you're just going to kind of tell me what's changing about these things during this decade. Then with your other ones, you're going to read the article. This one comes from the Other America, talking about poverty in the United States. And you answer these questions. And then handout number 3 is going to be about growing pains of a brand new city. And you're going to answer those 3 questions. That's about those like Levittowns that we talked about. Handout number 4, it tells you that there's no questions that go along with these pictures. So there's nothing that you have to answer, but I do want you to take a minute to just look at what the pictures are showing. And then after that, you are going to write me a full paragraph with a 5-sentence minimum using the information that you learned from the reading to tell me, were the 1950s a decade of prosperity or a decade of hardship? And again, you need to choose a side. I say this a lot. I understand that it was both. I want you to tell me which one it was more of and be able to back that up with evidence from what you learned about in your assignment. So you're going to do that. You're going to submit it. And then whenever you're done with that, if you have missing work, make sure that you're completing it, getting it done. If you have any questions, you know how to get in touch with me. And I will see you guys next time. Bye, y'all.